It's my pleasure to introduce two very close friends who you'll recognize by virtue of what they have done and the impact that they've had on life. Eric Lander is one of the top scientists in America today. He's one of the co-discoverers of the human genome, and most importantly, worked with me and others when he served as the president's chief science or co-chief science advisor under President Obama. Jeff Dean, senior vice president of research for Google, you know because you use his products every day. If you use Spanner or MapReduce, any of those, he is literally the person who invented those, and the rest is history. And of course, he started our Google Health activities in terms of AI and platforms. Please welcome Jeff Dean and Eric Lander. Yes, hi, Jeff.
Thank you.
Yes, and hi, Eric. Nice to see you. There's so many things to talk about, and with this audience, I want to talk not just about cloud, but also about science and the things that you guys have done. Let's start with, Eric, with you. Your background is first and foremost as a mathematician.
Yes.
You were not actually started as a biologist, you started as a mathematician. And of course, now you're one of the most successful biologists ever. What happened in the data world in biology as you grew up in it?
Yeah, the data world in biology, it's pretty easy to describe what it looked like in the early 1980s when I first got involved in biology, which was there was no data world. The Whitehead Institute for Biomedical Research, which is where I had my first position in biology, when they were planning the building and building it in 1983, it had no provision for a computer room anywhere in the building. At the last minute, just before they were going to move in, they built a computer room because they thought that a computer might be useful.
What did they do instead?
Well, I mean, all data was stored in your notebook. If it was important data, you wrote it down, and it was in your notebook, and the thought that I might want data in your notebook, I might go down the hall and talk to you and get some data from your notebook. But within 7 years or so, by 1990, the Human Genome Project got launched. And so I was involved in this Human Genome Project, and from 1990 to 2003, the whole world worked together to read out one human genome, that is the 3 billion letters of one person's DNA. And that took 13 years, and we spent $3 billion doing that. And the thought that we were going to do a whole lot more of those was not particularly in our mind at the beginning because it was $3 billion.
It's the 3 billion for one.
3 billion for, so 3 billion letters of DNA for $3 billion.
Okay.
Such a deal.
Can I buy a vowel?
Sorry?
Can I buy a vowel?
Can you buy a vowel? Yes. You can get an A. It's the only vowel we've got in the 4-letter code of DNA. But it's gotten a lot cheaper to get an A because in the 15 years since we finished the Human Genome Project, the cost of sequencing DNA has fallen by about 4 million-fold. That's 3 times faster than Moore's Law. And it means that just at the Broad Institute that I direct, just at the Broad alone, we sequence one new human genome coming off the line every 9 minutes. And we do it for about $800. So we recently passed 100,000 whole genomes and a lot more partial scans of genomes. Worldwide, there might be 500,000 genomes, and it's going up and up and up. It's just stunning the rate at which we generate data. So for a field where you didn't even think you'd have a computer room, today at a biomedical research institute, we have hundreds of people in our data science platform who do things that you would recognize here in Silicon Valley. And so it's just the biggest shift you could imagine. You can't be a biologist today without data.
So I want to come back to the big data implications because they combine both of your activities. Now, Jeff, you are obsessed at the moment about the retina, and in particular something called the fundus. Why are you obsessed, literally, with retina?
Right. So I think the reason we're obsessed is there's actually been a lot of fundamental advances in general purpose computer vision. So we've gone from basically not being able to see very well with computers to being able to see very well. And this has broad implications across a whole range of different industries, because if you think back to the time that animals evolved eyes, we're sort of now at that point in computing. Computers can now see and understand the world around them. And one of the fields that this has major implications for is in various kinds of medical imaging problems. Because now we can actually train machine learning models to take, for example, in ophthalmology, a fundus image, which is a picture of the back of your retina, and then make an assessment of whether that retina shows symptoms of a disease called diabetic retinopathy, which is the fastest growing cause of blindness in the world. There's about 400 million people at risk for this around the world, many in sort of countries without very many ophthalmologists. And we now have machine learning models that not only are as good as board-certified ophthalmologists, but in more recent work, we've gotten them to be as good as retinal specialists at diagnosing this kind of disease. And we think that's just an example of the kind of implications that we'll have for using machine learning in healthcare.
But you had a recent result that was striking to me, where you could look into somebody's eye and predict whether they smoked or not, right? Their sex. It looks like you can predict the quality of their heart health with this exam.
Yeah.
People are excited that you'll be able to offer a tool to a cardiologist. Number one cause of death worldwide is heart disease of one kind or another. You can literally tell how they're doing in their eye.
Right. So it's actually super interesting. The assessing diabetic retinopathy is something ophthalmologists know how to do given time and looking at an image. What's interesting is I will tell you a bit of a story of scientific discovery. So Lily Peng, who heads up the diabetic retinopathy machine learning work we've been doing, we had a new person join the software team, and we have a software pipeline to train machine learning models from retinal images to different things. And she said, oh, this new person, why don't you go off and see if you can train a model to predict age and gender from the retinal image? She thought that they wouldn't be able to predict gender at all, because ophthalmologists don't really know how to predict gender. But it would at least tell if the pipeline was working. And so she said, well, go off and come back when you've done that. And the person came back and said, OK, I've done that, and I can predict gender with 75% accuracy. And Lily said, no, that can't be right. Why don't you go off and check everything and come back when you've really checked it? And so they came back, and they said, OK, now I can do it with 90% accuracy. So that really led the team to say, hey, maybe there's more information in the retinal images than we really thought there was. And so they went off and started to predict a whole bunch of other things that are all sort of things that you might want to be able to predict that are indicators of your cardiovascular health. And so now we have kind of a combination of things that we can look for in the retinal image that actually allow us to assess cardiovascular health to the same level of accuracy as a more traditional, like draw blood, send the blood away to the lab, wait hours or days, get the lab test back.
So one of the things that you taught me a few years ago, Jeff, was that we're getting really good at looking at a sequence of numbers or facts and determining hidden patterns and predicting the next step. So a lot of the vision work is really looking back, seeing a pattern and discovering it. But we're also learning that we can discover all sorts of patterns that didn't exist. Now, in your research, Eric, you're doing a lot of this, and you're discovering strange things that people don't know. Can you take us through the big data impact? People assume that big data is useful for genetics, but it's useful for medicine.
Oh, yeah, right. It's pretty remarkable what you can do with big data. It's best illustrated by, I'll pick some diseases and sort of tell you what's happened because of large amounts of data. Schizophrenia, cancer, cardiovascular disease, and say generally cell biology in general. Schizophrenia. If you go back 7 years ago, the number of genes that we knew that definitively played a role in schizophrenia was approximately 0. We knew nothing. Today, that's numbers in over 200 genes that are definitively known to play a role in schizophrenia. And none of it came from prior biological hypotheses. It came because people collected 120,000 people with and without schizophrenia, and looked at them for millions of genetic variants, and started building models and correlating and validating. And in this way, we now have this list of 200 genes, and we don't understand what most of them do, but some of them we do. Number one on the list, it's involved in pruning the synaptic connections in the brain. And by the way, number 6 on the list is also involved. So suddenly we know that this disease involves that process. And now people are all turning their guns on the list and figuring out what do all these things do. So it's true for many inherited diseases that rather than knowing a lot, having prior hypotheses, asking the data is the best way to go. This is also turning out to be the case in cancer. We thought in the 1980s and 90s that we knew what the genes that cause cancer were about. They had played roles in certain signaling pathways in the cell. Well, that's true, but it turned out there were vast classes of genes we were missing. And if you looked at a lot of tumors and you read out their whole DNA and you started correlating where the mutations were, you could find whole new classes of genes based on those mutations. And those have implications for which patients respond to which medicines. Because it turns out the patients that respond to particular anti-cancer drugs often have particular mutations. Lung cancer is a great example, but there are many examples like that.
So one of the things that happened at Google maybe 5 years ago is that a team under Jeff started working on a platform for genetics on top of Google Cloud. And I remember meeting with them and saying, like, what's special, right? I mean, this is just data. But they explained that these sequencing machines produce an enormous amount of data, and that geneticists were having a lot of trouble managing the genomes. You have since done at Broad and Verily the productization of that product. What will be possible for a geneticist to do because of the cloud that you couldn't do before?
Yeah, so you have to realize that maybe with the genetics I was just telling you about, you might have done it with an extremely big spreadsheet and some sophisticated analysis. But now we're moving to the point where we really need to be thinking about truly massive data. So what do I mean? I mean reading out from every cell its pattern of which genes are on and off and how much. So there are 20,000 genes, so every cell is a vector of length 20,000. Every cell in your body is a point in 20,000 dimensional space. And we're getting to read these points out just in the last several years. So we can start reading out, well, hundreds first, thousands. We've now got several million. There's a worldwide project called the Human Cell Atlas that's on target to getting 1 billion cells, each described by its 20,000 dimensional vector, and then asking questions like, what's a cell type? It's a cluster in 20,000 dimensional space. What's biological development? It's a trajectory in 20,000 dimensional space. What are pathways and programs that the cell is running metaphorically? Well, we're going to have to cluster and organize the patterns of genes being turned on and off. And there is zero chance we are going to be able to do this without aggregating these data, normalizing these data, without writing extraordinarily sophisticated tools to do this. And this is not just abstract stuff. It's not just cute that you might find stuff about cells. It's fundamental to biology. You like the retina? Turns out people used to think the retina had a certain number of cell types. Once you started doing this, that number went from like 100 cell types to 200 cell types. We'd been blind to half of what's going on. You want to look at a cancer? Well, you know, people would take out a cancer, slice it up, and look at it in the microscope. But now they're taking out a cancer, and they're disaggregating it into the single cells, and they're asking, what are the cancer cells thinking? What are the immune cells thinking? What are the surrounding, what we call stromal cells thinking? And every cancer is getting described as collections of cells. And then, of course, it's being combined with imaging, because if you put the two on top of each other, and you can read the gene program on top of the physical layout, you can say, which cells are thinking what when they're near who? And so this is an explosion, and I've given up trying to project where it's going to go, because every time I feel like I'm making a projection that's too forward-leaning, it ends up being pokey some years later.
Well, what's interesting is, Jeff, you're struggling to the degree you ever struggle about anything, you're struggling about this issue of both the scale of the data and the scale of computation. It's interesting that Eric mentioned Moore's Law. Moore's Law has slowed down quite dramatically in the last few years. Thank goodness genetics is proceeding. But our engine, the engine that got us to this stage and frankly built Moscone, has slowed. You and your team developed something called a TPU, and we in fact just announced this morning, I think the 3rd generation. Yep. Why did you have to do a specialized architecture, and how do you use them, right? And can these people use them too?
Yeah. So as you observed, the progress in general purpose CPU performance due to Moore's Law has slowed down over the last sort of 12 years. It's sort of not been growing nearly at the rate it was the 30 years before that. And so just as we're having this explosion in machine learning sort of usage for really a wide variety of different kinds of problems. In fact, if you look at the field of machine learning, the rate of research paper production is growing faster than Moore's Law exponent over the last 10 years. So there's all these exciting new uses of computers for applying them to really interesting data sets and interesting problems just when our computing capability in general purpose CPUs is slowing down. So it turns out that deep learning machine learning algorithms tend to be made up of just a handful of specific kinds of operations. And there are really 2 nice properties that these algorithms have. So first, they're very tolerant of reduced precision. If you do all the computations to just 1 decimal digit of precision, that's perfectly fine with most of these algorithms. And second, they're all made up of a handful of sort of matrix multiply kinds of operations, vector dot products, linear algebra. So if you can build computers that are specialized to do only reduced precision linear algebra, that really broadens out the set of architectural choices you can have. You can really focus on building machines that are really extremely good at that. And that allows us to avoid the slowdown that's happening because the semiconductor process manufacturing is not happening as well.
You did something extraordinary along the way, which I haven't even mentioned, which is that you and your team created something called Tensor Flow. And the extraordinary part was its creation and its power. Tensors are essentially matrix multiplication, which is at the basis of all these algorithms. But you then gave the open source software to everyone, including all of our competitors and all of the other hardware, and 100% of the market is using it. Congratulations for giving all of this to our competitors.
Yeah. So, yeah, thank you. We have some happy TensorFlow users, which is great. I think, so TensorFlow is really the 2nd generation system that our research team put together in order to allow us to conduct our own research and also to put sort of some of that research into Google products. And when we first started out, I wrote a document about why we should open source that, because I felt like in the past, we haven't really open sourced some of the infrastructure innovations that we've built at Google, things like MapReduce or Bigtable or Spanner.
In hindsight, you might have also open sourced MapReduce way back when. But with TensorFlow, you knew that you had to get ahead of it and do it completely, and you just did it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so we wrote it in a way that was going to be easy to open source when we were done with an initial release. And that's been, I think, a really good choice because there's so many potential applications of machine learning around the world that are benefiting from having a sort of unified toolkit that all kinds of contributors around the world contribute to improve, that nonprofits and governments and organizations around the world and companies can build their machine learning use on a common set of tools, and that's been really great.
So it's very interesting you bring up the open sourcing of that, because the project that we've been working on, I think Andrea Norris mentioned it, the All of Us project that the NIH has done, was to build a data architecture for storing the data of that one government All of Us program. But in working with Verily and Vanderbilt University and the Broad, we decided to go out in the same way, of think about this as an open source architecture that would work for all of these projects. Indeed, there was some notion, and RFAs were put out for different groups to develop architectures for each separate project, as if what we should be doing for psychiatry was different than what we should be doing for cancer. And because we got out ahead of that, there's now a document on the web, the Data Biosphere, which is a statement of an open source architecture, how to modularize the relevant code, open APIs for it, and commitments by a lot of people. And all of the major 7 projects that are going on right now for different things in biology have adopted this same open source architecture, code on GitHub. And so it is our dear hope that we will avoid, by getting out ahead of it, what happened to EHRs, where we have many, many, many different incompatible systems. At the moment, there is a decent chance that for genomics and everything that goes with it, they will all talk to each other. And that's the power of open source.
Yep.
So I want to come back to the EHR and the medical data and trying to make sense of it. As we were talking earlier, that EHRs are very, very good, for example, at billing, but there's so much more than they can do. But I want to finish, Jeff, on this notion of computer architecture. We have this sort of joke that computing is cheap, but knowledge of what to do is priceless, right? And that what's happening is it's become so difficult to find people who have the requisite mathematical ability. These are very bespoke algorithms. When I talk to your team, the team at DeepMind, the team at Verily, it's very complicated to understand how to arrange the learning. You say, well, of course, these are learning systems, but the programming of the learning looks almost as hard to me as the original programming used to be. So you have an idea, and indeed launched a product a few months ago called AutoML, which should make a big dent at this hard-to-use problem.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I would say today, there's relatively limited expertise in the world about how to really fundamentally take a problem and solve it with machine learning. There's tremendous interest. You see the rate of research papers, the rate of undergraduate enrollment in machine learning classes is going up, exponentially. But there's still kind of tens or hundreds of thousands of organizations in the world that can effectively use machine learning today. And there's 10 million organizations that probably should be using machine learning and have data of the form that would be amenable to machine learning. So the idea, and the usual way you solve a machine learning problem is you have some data for a problem you care about, you have some computational resources, and then you have a human machine learning expert sit down and make a bunch of decisions and how you're going to model it, if it's a deep learning model, how many layers it's going to have, and what size filters. And you kind of stir it all together, and they run a bunch of experiments. And at the end, you get a solution to your problem, you hope. But the problem is there just isn't that much machine learning expertise in the world. And so we will rely and wait for educational institutions to produce more of that expertise. But we really want to broaden the accessibility so that more and more people in the world can use machine learning to solve problems they care about. And so AutoML is this idea that we can take machine learning problems and train a machine learning model to automatically learn to solve machine learning problems. And we use machine learning.
Sort of a meta machine learning.
Meta level of machine learning.
We'll learn how to make a machine learning algorithm.
Yeah. And so, for example, one of the first things we did in this area was Barrett Zoff and Kwok Lee, 2 researchers in our group, created a thing called neural architecture search, which basically is a method for finding good neural net architectures for solving problems. And the way that works is there's a model that generates architectures. You sample from that model, so you generate 10 of them. You train all 10 of them, and you see which ones worked well and which ones didn't.
So you generate a whole bunch, try them, kick out the ones that don't work.
And then this one got a 73, this one got a 92. So you say, well, do more like the one that got 92 and less like the one that got 73.
You can learn at the meta level.
Yeah, and then you iterate many, many times.
Now, this product is available to our customers in the audience.
It is. So the CloudML Vision product for vision problems has been available for months. And just today, there were a couple of new natural language processing AutoML products announced.
And just to be clear, the TPUs that we've talked about, the computational resources, the versions of MapReduce, Bigtable, Spanner, so forth, are all available in the Google Cloud offerings today.
Correct.
And Tensor Flow is available today in all of this.
Yes, it's been downloaded 15 million times, used in hundreds of organizations, thousands of organizations all around the world.
Okay, so don't waste any time and getting to this architecture. It is the defining architecture of the future. So in the time we have remaining, I thought I'd explore with Eric and with Jeff, where are we with hospitals, the medical system, the data problem? I mean, you've done fantastic work at the genetic level. You're beginning to develop drugs with partners and so forth. I think that one's pretty well wired, but we haven't seen the same benefit algorithmically. When you go into the hospital, it still feels like it's the dark ages. You have to fill out every form, nothing ever works. I can't get my MRI from over here to over here, and on and on and on. Explain to me where you think we are and where we might go. And Jeff, maybe you can talk a little bit about where you think we'll be going.
Yeah, it's frozen history that's set us back. Because hospitals got into these data systems early and didn't think about how all these pieces would fit together, we find ourselves in a situation where, it's a just Byzantine world broken up in different ways. And in most environments, people might just migrate to some good solution. But in a highly regulated environment, it's hard to do that. So we know, everybody in hospitals know, that lots of things are going on by hand that not only are a colossal pain for physicians, and every time a new rev of something is introduced at a hospital, people retire because they don't want to learn the new rev, and this really happens. But we know it's not just a pain in terms of workload and boring work and transcribing notes and things. We also know that we're missing so many insights. We know from what you've done with the retinal scans and other things that everywhere in the hospital there are signals. There are signals that let us anticipate who's going to be at risk of a kidney injury, whose mammogram doesn't really look like it has an obvious breast cancer, but there really is a signal there. And
so the signal, to be clear, with enough computing power and Tensor Flow and TPUs and so forth, we could go back and discover these that have not been seen before?
And people are doing that. We now see more and more evidence that when you run machine learning models on mammograms, when you run machine learning models on many other things, there's data there, but it wasn't evident to the eye. I guess just like in the eye, it wasn't evident that you could see cardiovascular outcomes.
And what about the physician problem? I think people here know that physicians are enormously under stress today. There's a huge burnout problem. There's a huge shortage of physicians with the aging of population. This is true not just in the United States, but globally. What can we do about that?
Well, look, the next generation of young physicians, and I get to see and work with them all the time, they know this. They know because everywhere else in their world, they interact with tech in the normal kind of way. So they are just incredibly anxious to get this in place. I think we need to take really seriously that this is a harder problem than many things that get done in tech, but maybe the single most important and satisfying problem to work on. I find at the Broad Institute, we get a lot of people from tech who come to work on this problem after they've worked on other things because they say they can't think of anything more important to do. We got to solve this in the next generation here, this next decade.
So it's interesting, Jeff, that again, way back when, you just started these projects. Why did you just start them?
Well, actually, I've always been interested in the use of computers for healthcare. My dad is an epidemiologist and was really interested kind of at the start of the personal computing revolution and how computing could be used to inform public health decisions. And I actually wrote some software in high school for epidemiology that is actually still one of my most cited works. I think where we are today is in the last 10 years in the US healthcare system, we've gone from basically having very little data in electronic health record form to most of it is now in electronic health record form, 10% to 90% or something like that. And that's a real tremendous opportunity because if you think about large healthcare systems with millions of patients and tens of thousands of doctors, tens of years of history per patient in these electronic medical records, we now have machine learning algorithms that are actually very good at sequential prediction kinds of tasks. Which, given a patient here, are they likely to develop diabetes, or are they, are they at high mortality risk right now?
So this goes back to this key thing that AI can do, which is predicting the next thing based on a history. So if I were to check into the hospital, they can probably predict what will happen next to me.
Right.
That will really help them.
Yeah. So essentially, the way I would view these models is if you have a healthcare system and medical records with, 100,000 medical doctor years of wisdom instilled in those decisions that are recorded in the medical record, you want those medical decisions to inform every doctor in the healthcare system so that they can make better decisions, so they can get like an instant second opinion or advice about these sorts of things. And we now have the capability with machine learning to make it so you can distill your 20,000 doctor colleagues into a tool for you.
So put your research hat on as opposed to your product hat. What are the researching things that you're doing in your research job that could ultimately lead to transformative products in this area? I know, for example, you're working in voice, right? The notion of voice transcription to help the doctors out.
Yeah, as you called out, one of the big stresses for doctors today is the way we've gone to electronic medical records, unfortunately, involves them doing a lot of sort of manual entry of data that ultimately goes into the EMR, and that's like additional work where they're not actually caring for patients. It's just kind of a documentation thing. That is the richness of data that is there, so it's great to have that data there. But we think you could use speech recognition, which now works much better, automatic summarization techniques that would allow you to go from a conversation between a doctor and a patient to a draft of the kind of information you'd actually want to enter into the medical note that would relieve doctors of a lot of the sort of documentation burden that they have today. And you'd also then probably get richer and more interesting information into the medical record.
So unfortunately, we have to stop. We can go on for hours. For me, it's a privilege to be with you, but it's an even bigger privilege to be with the two perhaps biggest heroes of my life. If you look at what Jeff did in the last 15 years and imagine what he'll do for all of us in computing, it's extraordinary. Eric Lander's contribution to our world is difficult to describe. It's so broad. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.